Jimmy Carter has died. 100 years old. Arguably a worse ex-president than he was president, but that's not what you're hearing on much of the mainstream television. Here is MSNBC Hee-Haw's Nicole Wallace, number 13.
Taken as a whole, his life is a portrait of a man who represents the very best this nation has to offer, a legacy as a public servant and as a humanitarian, who is a beacon of decency, something his longtime friend, President Joe Biden, knows firsthand.
Beacon of decency. You know, he wrote a book in which he referred to Israel as an apartheid state. I kid you not. He got criticized. He then changed part of his book after he got criticized. A number of the members of the board of his Carter Foundation resigned. And in a meeting, town hall, Carter was asked about the people who resigned from his board after his book on apartheid. And he said, well, they were Jews. And there was a lot of pressure on them. I'm just saying. When Al Sharpton endorses your character, number 14?
I think that for a season, sometimes less character and less being of a certain standard and value will have a season, but it will not last. Let's remember, Jimmy Carter was elected in '76, right after we were dealing with Watergate, where President Richard Nixon had to resign from office, and the Vietnam War. And people turned to a man who most of the voters at that time didn't even know of, and had just been governor of Georgia. First time we had a governor from the Deep South in 100 years, because they wanted character, because they wanted somebody to bring us out of what had been a disgrace with Watergate and what was an endless one, Vietnam. So he represented hope, and he never let that go. He was a deep Southerner that stood up for civil rights. He was very close with the King family, both Daddy King Sr. and Coretta Scott King, Martin III, and I talk about it often. His education department, Joe Califano, funded the Push Excel program, the education work of Reverend Jesse Jackson. So he reached out and he did things that brought the country together. It was the economy and the gas lines and things. I was in my early 20s, but I remember it. That cost him, I think, his defeat. But he never, ever lowered his standards. When I had my several encounters with him, he always asked me about my prayer life, always talked about his faith.
I can't take anymore. Says the man who became famous by falsely accusing white men of raping Tawana Brawley. He's never apologized for it. Says the guy who fanned the flames during the Crown Heights riots in 1991 that one New York Jewish leader called the most serious pogrom in the history of America. Says a man who's in the streets of Ferguson before one word of testimony had been taken, yelling, "No justice, no peace," even though we found out that Michael Brown did not have his hands up, did not say don't shoot. Cop was completely exonerated. Says a man who was essentially accusing the stripper and Duke of being raped, and then later on said he wasn't involved, and in fact he was. That he has a gig on television once a week and makes regular appearances is jaw-dropping, yet in a nation that he considers to be racist. This is also a guy who was paid over $500,000 to give a suck-up interview to Kamala Harris and didn't tell MSNBC Hee-Haw. And they were not happy about it, but I knew they weren't going to fire him. Are you kidding me? He's like James Bond. He's got a license to kill. Jonathan Adler is another lefty on Morning Joe, praising Jimmy Carter, number 15.
President Carter led what can only be called an epic American life. He was born, as we know, 100 years ago, 1924, but it might as well have been the 19th century, even earlier. No indoor plumbing, no electricity, no mechanized farm equipment. So in some senses, he was actually the only person you could think of who effectively lived in 3 centuries, the 19th century, the 20th century, of course, where he was involved with all of the great movements of that century, not to mention being president. And then the 21st, where he's been on the cutting edge, and the Carter Center has been central in the challenges of global health conflict resolution, democracy promotion, the big issues of our century. And so I think it's important to look at him beyond this easy shorthand that you see everywhere. You know, mediocre president, great former president. Actually, that cliche is only half true. He was an inspirational former president who redefined that role, as Joe Biden said yesterday. But he was a much better president than people recognize. He's not going to go on Mount Rushmore, but he was in many ways a visionary American president who put a lot of points on the board for the environment with his domestic legislation and other areas. And internationally, even beyond Camp David, the Panama Canal treaties, his human rights policy, normalization of relations with China, even bringing the hostages home safely. The foreign policy record of Jimmy Carter is much undervalued, and I think there's a long overdue appraisal underway of his presidency.
Wow. I'm surprised he's not on Mount Rushmore. Now, President Biden talks about Jimmy Carter's passing and then took a shot at Trump, number 6.
Is there anything that President Trump to take from
Decency. 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 Everybody deserves a shot. Everybody. Can you imagine Jimmy Carter walking by someone who needs something and just keep walking? Can you imagine Jimmy Carter referring to someone by the way they look or the way they talk? I can't. I can't. You know, I think the end of the deal here is that one of the reasons why we're looked to by the rest of the world, for the bulk of our nationhood, we've laid out what our values are. We've said what we believe. It's not just in the Declaration, we hold these truths to be self-evident, but there's a feeling. The rest of the world looks to us. And he was worth looking to.
Now, out of all of the programming I watched yesterday, it was pretty much wall-to-wall after he died. Nobody, not even on conservative television, mentioned that this man of decency, who was a better ex-president than president, trashed the election of Donald Trump by saying in a forum, we've played it for you before, I believe once the examination has been complete, it will be determined that the Russians put Donald Trump there. In other words, he was an election denier. And not just a pundit election denier. Not just a journalist election denier. Not just a lower-level Democrat election denier. A former president of the United States denying that Donald Trump legitimately won the election in 2016. I didn't hear a single person mention that. Now, there are a couple of articles we're going to go over. Jimmy Carter was a terrible president and an even worse former president. Article in the National Review by Philip Klein, the editor of the National Review. And another one in the Daily Caller called Jimmy Carter's True Legacy is Disastrous Anti-Semitism. Thanks for watching these clips from The Larry Elder Show. If you enjoyed this content, be sure to subscribe to my channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss a moment. More thought-provoking discussions are just a click away, so stay tuned, and we'll see you in the next one.